We begin our journey at St Michael and All Angels Church in the village of Ravenstone in northwest Leicestershire.
Ravenstone has seen many changes over the past few centuries. Trees have grown and trees have been felled. Houses have been built and houses have been demolished. People have stayed and people have left. Here, close to the entrance of Ravenstone Churchyard, proudly stands a headstone to two men who fought in the Crimean War. On it we have their names, William Baxter and Thomas Baxter. We have the regiments they fought with, the battles they fought at, and what happened to them. But who were they really? What was Ravenstone like when they grew up? What was Britain like when they grew up? What were their prospects for the future? And why did they end up fighting in the Crimean War? Today, in honour of these two men, and the many like them, we're going to find some answers to those questions. We hope you enjoy. Hello, it's Isaac and Jack here.
We began our journey into the lives of the Baxters by visiting the Leicestershire and Rutland Family History Society Research Centre, where we met Sue, who helped us get a better understanding of who the Baxters were and their relationship to one another.
Thank you for having us along. So what have the society discovered about the Baxter brothers?
Well, the first question is, actually, are you sure they were brothers? Because we've struggled to find a baptism for Thomas and William from the same parents.
Okay. Well, we assumed because they're on the same stone that they were brothers, but maybe that's not the case.
Well, it's possible. I mean, it could be that the village had decided to have a commemoration to the two Baxters, and we've almost assumed historically that they were brothers. I mean, what we found a Thomas in 1821, for instance, who was the son of another Thomas and Anne.
Okay.
He had some siblings, but we haven't found a William in that family. We have found a William Baxter who was the son of a William and Hannah Baxter.
Okay.
So we're thinking, could they have been cousins?
Following Sue's revelation that the Baxters were not brothers, she explained to us they shared a paternal grandfather and showed us their immediate family. William was the son of William Baxter and his wife Jane, and was born in 1818. Thomas was the oldest son of Thomas and his wife Anne Baxter, and was born in 1820. His siblings were Jane, born 1824, Elizabeth, born 1826, and twins George and Charles, born in 1828.
In the 18th century, the poor travelled very little, and many people lived and died in the villages they were born, rarely travelling further than 10 miles outside of their village.
Enclosure Acts for small areas had been passed sporadically since the 12th century, but advances in agricultural knowledge and technology in the 18th century made them more commonplace. Following the enclosure of common lands around Ravenstone in 1770, common lands passed into the ownership of the landed classes. This reduced the ability of the agricultural labourers to produce their own food, and restricted the ability of settled workers to decline the low wages which were offered by landowners. A poem from the 18th century reads as a protest against the Enclosure Acts.
They hang the man and flog the woman who steals the goose from off the common. Yet let the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law demands that we atone when we take things we do not own, yet leaves the lords and ladies fine who takes the things that are yours and mine. The poor and wretched don't escape when they conspire the law to break. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, and geese are common still will lack until they go and steal it back.
As work was seasonal, times became increasingly hard, and this was exasperated by large families. It was normal practice for children to be put to work almost as soon as they were old enough to walk. As such, they received little education and soon became familiar with long working days. Agricultural labourers and their families were often living hand to mouth, and in poorer areas what money was available was sufficient only to feed the parents and the younger children. Therefore, once a child had reached the age of 13, they were packed off to work elsewhere. The agricultural classes, besieged by low wages, little food and minimal opportunities to see beyond the hedgerows of their villages, turned to the British Army as a way out. The army offered regular pay, 3 square meals and a chance to see the world. The relationship was not one way, however. The army looked to recruit from the class who worked away from the growing smog and grime of the industrial centres. During a military inquiry held into the effectiveness of army punishment, when a sergeant of the 17th Regiment of Foot was asked, "Which do you find the best soldier, the agricultural or the manufacturing labourer?" he answered, "The agricultural labourer. There are no men so good soldiers as the man who comes from the plough." As agricultural technology developed, the number of workers required on the land declined. In Leicestershire, unrest was limited due to the alternative form of employment offered by the coal mines. However, due to the risks associated with mining, many families looked for an alternative career for their offspring in the army. Sue explained how the difficulties of surviving as a family in rural Leicestershire impacted on the Baxters directly.
I've looked at the baptism records from Ravenstone for any child born to a Baxter couple. And what's really interesting, we've got about 36 Baxters over a period of time. And nearly all of them, 3/4, the parents were labourers or colliers miners. So you're thinking about labouring work, farming work, difficult to get, lots of movement from farm to farm, not very reliable work. And I think for some people at that time, a career in the army, work in the army, might have been seen as a favourable thing to do. Obviously, you're not going to know what lies ahead.
William had joined the Coldstream Guards before the age of 16 and was posted to Canada with the 2nd Battalion in 1834. It is clear that Thomas followed this career path soon after, and on the eve of the Crimean War was a private in the 95th Regiment of Foot, territorially designated as the Derbyshires. The British and French armies crossed the Black Sea and landed on the Crimean Peninsula on the 14th of September 1854. They were positioned to the northwest of Sevastopol, which the taking of was to be their objective. Despite months of preparation, their landing at Calamita Bay was a disaster, taking over 5 days for the whole army to disembark. Unlike the French and the Ottomans, the British did not even manage to make camp for the ordinary soldiers for the first evening. Supplies and medical supervision were extremely limited, and outbreaks of cholera began to spread amongst the troops. By September 19th, the Allies began to move south, where the Russian Prince Alexander Menshikov and a force of around 30,000 men had taken up a strong position on the heights above the River Alma. By mid-morning, the Allied army was assembling on the plain, looking up towards the more than 100 field guns that the Russians had assembled on the heights. Thomas and the 95th were the leftmost regiment of de Lacy Evans' 2nd Division. Their objective was the 18-gun Russian battery atop Telegraph Hill. William and the Coldstream Guards were part of the 1st Division with the other Guards regiments, and these were positioned in a line behind the Light and 2nd Divisions. The Allied plan had been for the two armies to advance simultaneously, but at the final moment Raglan decided to delay the British advance until the French had broken through on the right. The British troops were ordered to lie on the ground within range of the Russian guns, in a position from which they could scramble to the river when the time was right. They lay there for an hour and a half, losing men as the Russian gunners found their range. Finally, the order was given for the British to support the French and advance. Once they had crossed the river, all order was lost. With all momentum lost, 2nd Division's knotted formations were exposed to the fire of the Russian guns, which decimated the 95th. Whereas most of 2nd Division's regiments sought cover in walled vineyards lining the Alma's north bank, Major Champion would have none of this. With a cry of "Come 95th, show them the way," he led Thomas and the men across the river, and reinforced by William and the guards, they slowly advanced uphill to victory. During the course of the battle, Thomas was slightly wounded, but would continue to remain with the 95th and the rest of the British Army. The Allies advanced south to besiege the fortified Russian naval base at Sevastopol. A 25,000-strong Russian field army attacked their lines in an attempt to capture the British supply base at Balaclava on the 25th of October 1854, which featured the infamous charge of the Light Brigade. Although the British had held on, the weakness in their lines had been revealed. The following afternoon, the Russians mounted a 6,000-strong infantry attack against the exposed right flank of the Allies on the heights of Inkerman, held by Thomas and some 3,000 infantrymen of the British 2nd Division. Here, at the Battle of Little Inkerman, the Russians lost close to 1,000 men before retreating. British losses totaled 12 killed and 63 wounded, one of whom was Thomas, wounded again and evacuated from the battlefield. 10 days later, the Russians mounted a full-scale attack at Inkerman with 42,000 men. William and the Coldstream Guards made up a force of only 2,700 men tasked with holding the British line. On a Sunday morning, the thinly spread British could hear the church bells at Sevastopol ringing to encourage the Russian soldiery forwards. As the Russians continued to come on, savage fighting broke out, and William and the Coldstream Guards charged the enemy at the point of the bayonet 11 times. They went into action with about 400 men and had upwards of 200 rank and file killed and wounded, including Ravenstone's William Baxter. Thomas arrived at Scutari Hospital in early November, around the time Florence Nightingale also arrived. Despite her improvements to the conditions, Thomas Baxter sadly passed away from his injuries in April 1855. Following Inkerman, the Russian resolve in the field was broken, and a series of Allied victories led to the signing of the Treaty of Paris in March 1856. This neutralised the Black Sea and the Dardanelles, and checked Russian imperialism in southern Europe. The impact of the Baxters on a global scale has now become clear, so it is no surprise that on a local level, they were not forgotten. In addition to the headstone erected at Ravenstone, Sue revealed William and Thomas were mentioned in the Leicester Advertiser in February 1858.
And we were really interested to see, it says, a memorial stone in the churchyard at Ravenstone records the deaths of William and Thomas Baxter. The former Coldstream Guards fell at Inkerman. The latter belonged to the 95th Regiment, wounded at the Battle of Alma and Inkerman, and sadly died 1855. But you know, that puts the gravestone really in perspective in terms of details recorded at the time in a newspaper.
Yeah, Leicestershire Crimean heroes.
Oh yes.
The legacy of the Baxters' actions for Britain still remained in the family for many years to come, as Sue revealed.
30 years after the death of these Baxters, we noticed that there'd been somebody baptised in the village called William Inkerman Baxter. Now, obviously, you know, we've got the death of one of the Baxters at Inkerman, and we thought there's possibly a family connection there. We'd have to look into a bit more detail, but it seems a bit of a coincidence.
Wow, yeah.
And we know that that battle is commemorated on the gravestone. So it could be, family stories, etc. They wanted to almost pay tribute.
From a headstone stood at the entrance to the tranquil churchyard at Ravenstone, we have seen how William and Thomas Baxter, who were raised among a class beset with problems and lacking in opportunity, found their place in an army that represented the ambitions of a nation that had its sights on much of the globe. Sent to a distant shore far from the fields of Ravenstone that they grew up in, they played their part in a conflict that would shape the future of Europe to the present day. For this, it is paramount that they are remembered, and their place in history is not left to become a thing of the past.